Welcome to a podcast by Mr. Nelson Dean on various topics in AP World and European History. If you are one of my students, this is likely your introduction to my podcast. I hope that you will enjoy sort of coming along with me on this journey, both in the classroom and here online as well when you should require it. If you are not one of my classroom students, I hope you enjoy going through this process of learning AP World and European History with us. So today we're going to be talking about prehistory. When we're defining history, we're always going to think about history as the period that is covered by the written record. So therefore, any time prior to the development of writing is going to be a form of prehistory. Now that, of course, is not to say that when we are doing histories throughout the course, we will not be looking at archaeological evidence and non-written materials of various kinds, but history must include the written record. So this early period where we have no written record to rely on is going to be referred to as prehistory, and that's sort of what we're going to be covering today. Now, a couple of things that we need to note. First of all, for my students, these lectures are very much intended to be supplemental. I would not consider these an alternative to completing your reading assignments and participating in class and all that sort of stuff. This should be an add-on to help you. So make sure that you use it as such. Thing to note number two: all the dates that we're going to be discussing are approximations. Particularly with this prehistorical period and before the development of written records, we are relying largely on carbon dating and other archaeological evidence. And I think, as you will see as we go through the course, even when we're talking about written records, sometimes the clarity of the past is not what we would like for it to be. Sometimes some of these distinctions are going to be a little bit hazy, and therefore this is a good lesson to us in the way that we need to approach world history in particular. Don't necessarily worry so much about exact years. Worry about periods of time. Think about chronology. Try and treat this as a story. What happens before what happens after what, and all that kind of thing. Again, like specific numbers, not going to be our primary concern. And then last point of order, we need to keep in mind that these notes will be covering material that is mandated by the AP curriculum, which operates based on the theory of evolution. Now, this is a really, really good sort of lesson for us. Whether or not you ascribe to the theory of evolution or to some other view of human origins that is based on an alternative theory or an alternate faith system, we need to keep in mind that in history, we have to see everything as an interpretation that's based on available evidence. That may not necessarily mean that it is the only interpretation. It may not even necessarily mean that it is ultimately the best interpretation. It does also not mean that that interpretation may not change over time as new evidence is brought to light. And this is what we refer to as historiography. Historiography is the sort of history of history, or the study of history, if you will. Looking at history that has already been written, looking at the way that the historians and their ways of looking at the world influenced the way that they saw the past. And this is something that we're going to talk a lot about in this course. It's something that you're going to be seeing a lot of. And I don't necessarily want to beat it to death here, but we need to keep in mind that we as historians bring to the table certain assumptions and certain beliefs, and other historians before us and certainly after us will come to the table with a different set of assumptions and beliefs and knowledge and all that sort of thing, and that's going to affect the way that we see the past. And so we need to acknowledge that as human beings, our ability to do history is colored by that. And this notion of the theory of evolution is an example of that, based on scientific evidence that has been discovered, that has been written about. We believe, or many people believe, I should say, that there is a certain way that humans have evolved and sort of emerged into the world. Some people don't agree with that. So that's something else that we will cover in greater depth later, but I just wanted to sort of acknowledge that at the outset. So some broad questions that we need to be keeping in mind. as humans are starting to sort of move about this celestial orb of ours, right? As they're starting to sort of traverse the planet, how and with what tools are they adapting to or modifying their environment? Because obviously you're going to need to operate very differently to live in southern Africa than you will to live in, say, northern Russia. Second, as agriculture starts to develop, what is going to cause the development of complex institutions, and what in specific places are going to lead to the development of specific institutions like government? That's something that we're actually going to largely cover in some subsequent podcasts. And then how do those above changes affect and/or how do they result from the specialization of labor? And then, of course, the sort of broadest question of all, why change? Why is it that over these various thousands or even millions of years, we see hominids and human beings making changes, evolving, developing new tools, developing new modes of interacting, all that kind of thing. So just sort of keep those questions in mind as we're sort of going through this process. So this is going to be a pretty quick pass through the first several million years of human history, in part because it doesn't necessarily receive a ton of emphasis on the AP exam, and then also in part because, well, I think there are some better ways that we will want to use our time sort of subsequently. So just to put out a couple of things real quick, we need to discuss first the notion of a hominid. Hominids are a collection of species of humans and sort of proto-humans. They are distinct from sort of apes, which again scientists believe are sort of our closest living relatives. And the thing that really makes hominids distinct from other species is this term here, bipedalism or bipedalism. And what that means is, for those of you who are familiar with your Latin, bi meaning two, pedal meaning to sort of like the feet, associated with feet, stand on. So 2 feet, as opposed to say an ape, which walks on all fours, even though they may sort of stand on their back legs for short moments of time. So bipedalism instantly was one thing that sort of set humans apart. Why is that? Well, a couple of reasons. Number one, if you are bipedal, particularly in these sort of grasslands of East Africa where we believe humans first evolved. If you are bipedal, you stand upright. That means you have a longer line of sight because you are farther off the ground. This not only allows you to spot potential food sources, but also potential threats, predators and so forth and so on. Also, if you are bipedal, and this is perhaps more important, your hands are free for work. Your hands are free to do other things. They can carry things. They can be using tools of some kind, which brings us to sort of the next thing that makes hominids different, and that is tool making. Now, we do know there are some other animal species that make/use tools, would perhaps be more accurate. Sea otters, for example, use rocks to crack open clams, and that kind of thing. But tool making with hominids is relatively quickly going to set itself apart because it's going to evolve and become much more complex. Now, our earliest hominid, Australopithecus, we see the remnants of an Australopithecine skull here, and then of course this would be a side view of a complete sample. Again, like 3 to 2 million years ago is mostly when they were doing their thing. Some really, really early Australopithecines may get as far back as 4 million. We do know that they were using some very simple tools. And you will want to remember a couple of things about them. Number one, they are using some very simple tools, but number two, they're the first species of where we have evidence of this bipedalism. And we can tell that because, number one, we have some preserved footprints, but number two, the angle of the pelvic bones and the way that they connect into the rest of the spinal column shows that they were walking upright as opposed to walking on all fours. So this is actually pretty important archaeological evidence that's been brought forward to us. Pretty remarkable stuff. And we get a lot of this information from a specimen of Australopithecus that was found in East Africa in the middle of the 20th century, known as Lucy. So, fast forward into the 3/4 of a million year ago range, give or take, maybe as far back as 1 million. We have Homo erectus, erectus meaning standing upright, right? So this is a more upright figure than Australopithecus, and as you can also see, there is a larger cranial capacity here, which is to say there is more space in the skull that is being set aside for the brain. And obviously, when you have a larger brain, you're going to be capable of more complex thinking and sort of intellectual exercises. So Homo erectus and then Homo habilis, who follows thereafter, are going to be making more complex tools, number one. And when we're talking about tools here, generally what we mean is that they're taking rocks and either sort of breaking them or shaping them in some way to give them like a sharp edge for something like a spear or an axe, or to use to sort of hammer things and pound things, that sort of stuff. The other thing that we see out of Homo erectus is that they are going to start using fire to cook food. And obviously, you can use fire for other purposes too. You to defend against animals. You can use it to make tools. You put stones in the fire, harden them, that sort of stuff. And then, of course, it also provides light and warmth. So the development of fire and tools going to be really, 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 really important for Homo erectus and Homo habilis. And that is, oh, no, too soon. And we need to think about what that's going to let them do in the big sense. I mean, if you can generate heat, if you can generate light, then you can begin operating in places that are colder. You can begin operating in places that are dark. And then, of course, if you can make tools, you can modify your environment in different ways. You can potentially cut down trees. You can kill animals. You can skin those animals. You can use the fire to cook them, all that sort of stuff. So with the development of fire and these more complex tools, we're going to see that Homo erectus and Homo habilis are now going to be able to start expanding beyond the sort of East African heartland that had traditionally been the home of these hominid species. Because now we have these ways that we can modify or adapt to the environment. We can make it warmer. We can provide ourselves with more light, and we can, cut things and kill things, so forth and so on. All those things that I sort of just listed. So, moving forward yet again, we have Homo sapiens that developed around 200,000 years ago, give or take. And if we go back to our skulls for a moment, you can see here that our sort of early Homo sapiens and our modern Homo sapiens, again, are continuing to follow that trend of increasing their cranial capacity. You'll also notice, by the way, that their brow ridges are getting smaller. That's this little ridge right here where our eyebrows are. And that would have been associated with these really, really strong jaw muscles that were needed to sort of crunch uncooked food like, plant fibers and possibly meats. You'll notice that that's going away, which provides us more evidence that they are further able to sort of modify their food to meet their needs. Now, when we're talking about Homo sapiens, even that is not necessarily like the last step. We actually have a variety of different sort of Homo sapiens specimens that are wandering around, including Cro-Magnons and Neanderthals. And actually here we see a Neanderthal skeleton compared with the skeleton of a modern human. You'll notice, of course, that the Neanderthal is bigger and sort of more robust than your standard human. But these species, there are a couple of really interesting things about them. We know with Homo sapiens that we are adding more complex intellectual life. We are adding language skills. Really for the first time, and that's a pretty big deal, because once you have language, there are a lot of new things that you can do. I mean, it's kind of like developing tools in fire, right? I mean, that sort of allows you to complete this new range of tasks. Well, once you can actually talk and communicate to each other, it allows you to do that many more things. So we can start living together in larger family groups. We can start taking knowledge of how to do things and passing that on to other people more easily, and all that kind of stuff. So again, it's a really, really big set of changes. We're also going to see, in some cases, the development of art. So we're going to have cave paintings starting to happen. we're also going to have complex burials, which are going to indicate that we may be getting the development of early religion with these people. And all of this development of language is part of what a scholar named Jared Diamond calls the Great Leap Forward. This, of course, oh, I've actually got a missing quotation mark there. This, of course, is not to be confused with the Great Leap Forward that we're going to talk about in the spring vis-a-vis Maoist China. That's a completely separate. It's a completely separate Great Leap Forward, so just keep that in mind. There's also been some pretty interesting information on Neanderthals that's come out in the last decade or so that's been really, really fascinating. For a long time, we believed, having looked at the skulls, Neanderthals may have been bigger, but they did not have quite the cranial capacity that modern humans did. And so they it was assumed for a long time, well, where did these Neanderthals go? Well, eventually we think that, humans just kind of, essentially destroyed them. And for a long time, we believed that modern humans just wiped out the Neanderthals so they wouldn't have to compete with them for food and, all that kind of thing. However, this new information that basically says that the Neanderthals were these big, dumb brutes that modern humans came along with their superior brains and just eliminated, is really, really not true for a couple of reasons. Number one, mapping of the human genome and actually the Neanderthal genome has shown us that Neanderthals and humans have the exact same gene that affects the language center of the brain, which is to say that regardless of whether or not it developed in the same way, Neanderthals certainly had the capacity for language, and likely they had it. And we know that they probably had language because in different Neanderthal communities, we see them producing stone tools using the exact same techniques. And that's really not something that you could replicate across space like that unless you had a concrete way of telling the other person how to do it. Also, we know that the Neanderthals were capable of manufacturing a kind of glue that they would use to sort of hold their tools together. It was actually relatively complex. They extracted it from birch bark. And then, this is the really interesting part, we have now found, having mapped these two genomes, that there's a lot of Neanderthal DNA in certain groups of modern humans. So now, instead of thinking that we just sort of killed them all off, a lot of people think that the two species essentially intermingled and bred together and generated just a human species that sort of obliterated the Neanderthal because they just sort of absorbed them rather than having killed them off. Pretty interesting stuff. So, we talked about the fact that beginning with Homo erectus, Homo habilis, and then continuing with Homo sapiens, we start migrating out of East Africa into all these various other parts of the world. And we talked about the fact that that is being driven by the development of these new tools and new abilities that are allowing us to survive in an increasingly wide range of environments. And you can see here how far that's able to take us relatively quickly, right? So what do we know about these early peoples? These, by the way, are going to be called Paleolithic peoples. This is the period that runs from, say, 100,000 years ago up to about 8,000 BCE, which stands for before current era. Or if you prefer the older designation, 8,000 BC, which stands for before Christ. So they were hunter-gatherers, which is to say they either killed their food or they, plucked it out of the ground or off a tree somewhere. Now, the traditional image of these Paleolithic hunter-gatherers is probably our image on the left, right? These, the men coming home with the animal that they've killed. Guys out there chasing woolly mammoths and saber-toothed tigers and so forth and so on. In reality, probably we should be thinking more about the image that we see on the left. We now know that these hunter-gatherers were in many ways kind of scavengers. About 80% of their food supply was derived from gathering, and there are a couple of reasons for that. Number one, hunting can be pretty high risk. Number one, any animal that is large enough to feed you and your family for a decent amount of time is probably going to have some kind of method of defending itself, whether it's teeth or horns or claws or whatever. Number two, hunting is not always guaranteed to be successful. You can track an animal, you can follow it, you can throw a spear or shoot an arrow at it, and you may not even find it. You may not kill it. And so, if you spend 2 days hunting down an animal and then fail to return home with it, you've essentially wasted that time. Roots and berries and, potatoes, other sort of like plants that you can just find around, number one, they can't run away from you. But number two, it's more guaranteed success once you find them. So most of the food supply was derived from a gathering. We believe a lot of that gathering was being done by the women, and a lot of the hunting was being done by the men. So we do have within these Paleolithic communities some allocation of labor, right? Okay, look, you take care of this part, I'll take care of this part. Between the two of us, we will come up with some food. So that's sort of what that's sort of what they're looking like in terms of the food that they're producing. So the characteristics of these groups. Number one, they're living in family groups, and you might be able to call them sort of clans of about 25 to 50 people. Why so few? Well, a couple of reasons. Number one, we've got to consider the carrying capacity of the land, right? I mean, there's only so many deer and so many roots and so many berries or whatever that one can find. And so, like, if you can't find enough food to feed your family, then, I mean, that's really all there is to it. You're not going to be encouraged to have the population sort of wildly grow out of control when there's no food. Second, infant mortality. Obviously, there's what is neonatal care? We don't even know right now, right? So a lot of these children would have potentially died very young, either from disease or complications related to the birth. And then, of course, the last thing we need to remember is if you are a hunter-gatherer, that means that you are nomadic. You do not live in a single place. You have to move around. You've got to follow the food, right? When the blackberries are in bloom, you need to be where the blackberries are. If you're hunting deer, you need to be where the deer are. And so if you are nomadic and you are a woman, you're having a child every year, you've got to carry 3 or 4 children around. So in a lot of these nomadic communities, we're going to see that they will sort of space out their children every 4 or 5 years so that, kid number one, by the time we have kid number two, kid number one is able to walk on his or her own relatively reliably and sort of keep up with the group. And some of this is based on archaeological evidence. Some of this we also know because there are still nomadic hunter-gatherers that exist today. Even though we sort of associate them with the Paleolithic period, we need to keep in mind that when this Neolithic transition happens, everybody doesn't just completely switch over, right? I mean, there are still groups that are living that way, in the 21st century. So, other characteristics. We are using stone tools, hence the term Paleolithic, because paleo is a Greek word that is associated with stone and rock. Most of their tools are being made from flint and obsidian, and most of them are being used to help them secure food, or in some cases to start fires. There's also this kind of neat tool called the atlatl, that is actually a spear throwing device. So if you're out hunting a deer or something, it will allow you to throw a spear farther with greater stopping power and greater accuracy. And then again, since we've had the development of these language skills, we're also developing a material culture. So in the archaeological record now, we're not only finding tools, we're also finding cave paintings. These are some examples from France at a place called Lascaux. We're going to look at those in class. Then we're also getting some other artwork, some statuary. These are called Venus figurines. We'll be taking a look at those in class as well. So now, here's what gets interesting. People for almost 100,000 years at least, really a good deal longer than that if we think about our earlier hominids, are going along, they're hunting, they're gathering, they're living in their small family groups, and everything is just fine. However, once we get to about 10,000 years ago, so maybe about 8,000 BCE, and again, this is give or take, right? These are not exact figures. We are going to have this gradual switch, this gradual transition from gathering plants to actively cultivating them. And so we don't know exactly, but we imagine it probably works something like this. Hey, Every year, when we walk by this area as we're transitioning to our next campsite, we find these bushes that have berries on them. Awesome. We eat the berries, everybody's happy. And then one of us thinks, if we took the seeds from these berries and sort of scattered them about, more plants may grow, and then next year, or 2 years from now, maybe there will be more berries. That would be awesome. And then maybe we can even directly put the seeds into the ground a certain distance apart, so that they, like the various berry bushes, won't compete with each other. And then, well, probably we need to stay kind of close by, because if we get here after the berries ripen, they may all have been eaten by birds and other animals. And then, of course, when the berries are ripe, we have to pick them all. And then we have to come up with a way, since we've spent this extra time and effort on this food, we need to find a way to preserve those berries and make them keep for the next year. And then the next year, we've got to come along and sort of do it all over again. So very quickly, well, not very quickly, I should say, very slowly, over time, people are going to switch from this hunting and gathering to relying more and more on gathering, and then relying more and more on gathering specific crops that they're actively modifying in some way, right? And so it changes the way that humans are getting their food supply. So why do we do this? Number one, agriculture is going to help us generate surplus food, right? Once we can get this system set up, we can grow stuff, we protect it until it's time to harvest it, we can actually generate just more of it, right? It allows us to escape some of those old problems that we had with the carrying capacity of the land. Number two, it's relatively reliable, right? We don't have to chase a deer around anymore. All we have to do is go out to that same field every single time. Now that, of course, is assuming we don't have a drought or a flood or a plague of locusts or something. Number three, it's going to allow us to build permanent settlements. We can settle down, we can be in the same place, we can make better, stronger houses, and all that sort of stuff. And there are other advantages too. We'll sort of have a relatively robust discussion about this in class. Now keep in mind, there are also some downsides to this Neolithic transition that we're going to talk about, again, quite extensively in class, so I won't beat it to death here. Certainly, it's going to have an adverse effect on human health by exposing them to disease and making their diet less varied. It is also going to be blamed, at least, for the development of a lot of social stratification and patriarchy and slavery and racism and all that kind of thing as well. So there are a lot of problems with this Neolithic transition that many people would argue we still have not entirely gotten past. So just keep that in mind. And again, I won't beat it to death here because we're going to talk about it extensively in class. This is one of our early Neolithic settlements. This is at a place called Catalhoyuk. It's now in Turkey, in eastern Turkey. And this is an artist's recreation based on the archaeological evidence that's been found at the site. And there are two things that are really, really interesting about it. Number one, you'll notice that there are no doors anywhere on the sides of these buildings. All of the access to the buildings was done from the roof. And this is relatively obvious why. I mean, you can keep out animals that way. You can just climb up with your little ladder, take it with you, close the roof, and you're done. The other thing that's really fascinating about the site is it's a site of sequent occupants. So in other words, like over time, say like one family moves away or dies off, a house collapses, something like that, people would just build new houses on top of that old foundation, right? So we know that they're continuously reusing the same site for long periods of time. We'll talk a little bit more about that in class. So once this Neolithic transition happens, where we switch from just sort of gathering our food semi-randomly to actually, engaging in agriculture, a couple of characteristics of these Neolithic cultures, or what some people would call civilizations, that we need to be aware of. Number one, surplus production. Like I said, we're going to be creating a larger supply of food. And we're creating it all in one place. So if we're creating a larger supply of food and it's all in one place, we're going to have urban settlement, right? We're going to start getting larger groups living together in settled urban societies. So we're going to have cities for the first time. We're also going to have specialization of labor because even though agriculture actually requires more hours out of the farmer than hunting and gathering required out of the hunter and the gatherer, once that farmer puts in those hours, he's going to be able to grow enough surplus to feed more than just himself, right? He'll be able to feed several people. So then, if the farmer has, sort of got the food thing on lockdown, then somebody else can take over other jobs, like maybe building houses, or maybe functioning as a guard to protect the farmer from other people who might be trying to steal that farmer's food. And then, of course, when the farmer harvests the food, they've got to develop a system of exchanging that food for whatever these other people are producing, right? I'll give you a chicken, you give me that basket. I'll give you a bushel of wheat, and you give me an axe, that kind of thing. So we've got to have some sort of mode of exchange. And then, of course, if we have these modes of exchange of specialized labor, we're going to need complex institutions to run all of those things. We're going to need a government to decide how we're going to divide up the food. We're going to have to tax people so that we can make sure that everybody is getting enough to get by, or to make sure that the community are all contributing to various sort of government expenses, the maintaining of the army, for example, to protect us and that sort of stuff. We're going to develop religion as we start to want ways to ensure that the harvest will be good. And then, of course, social stratification is naturally going to happen in a lot of ways because, at some point somebody's going to ask, well, is the farmer better than the priest, or is the priest better than the farmer? And then, of course, once we've got all these complex institutions, we have to develop a writing system that is going to allow people to keep records of all of this silliness that we've developed, right? Now, every civilization that we're going to see throughout the course may not have all of these characteristics, so this is sort of a general list. And we'll want to remember to think of all of this in terms of the famous children's book, If You Give a Mouse a Cookie. Again, if you have surpluses, people are going to need to live near the surpluses. We're going to need people to protect it. We're going to need people to preserve it. We're going to need people to pray to the gods for the harvest. We're then going to have to exchange food for other goods, all these sorts of things, right? So once you make that small but fundamental and irrevocable change of harvesting your food in this very direct way that is known as agriculture, that's going to just sort of ripple through the rest of these human societies, and it's going to change everything about them. And we're going to watch the way that plays out in a couple of different places as we go through this sort of first part of AP World History. So, with that in mind, where do we build our Neolithic settlements? Well, number one, we've got to put it near food and water, obviously. And number two, we're going to have to consider the climate and the biome. And to that end, we need to discuss this notion of geographic determinism. This is an idea that is talked about a lot by Jared Diamond, and again, my students will be reading an article of his that suggests that when we look at these early so-called civilizations, the places where we first see these major agricultural societies that are developing all these complex institutions pop up are in Egypt, in Mesopotamia, in what is today northern India and the Indus Valley, and then in parts of China. And so you'll notice they all kind of generally follow this line of latitude right here, and that's referred to as the east-west axis. And the reason for that, according to Jared Diamond, is that this is sort of the sweet spot, right? The climate is neither too hot nor too cold necessarily, at least on average. That is a climate that works for the growing of high-calorie food crops like wheat and barley, and perhaps just as important, and actually also rice as well, but perhaps just as importantly, this is also a climate and a biome that is good for so-called draft animals. Draft animals are animals that we use to pull stuff. So horses, oxen, water buffalo, all that sort of stuff. And so not only are we going to have these high-calorie food crops to feed us, but we're going to have these draft animals that are going to help us do work. And so particularly when historians look at the reasons that, say, like this part of the world, right, Asia, China, or I should say, China is part of Asia, East Asia, which is where China is, South Asia, which is where India is, Southwest Asia, North Africa, and then, eventually later on Europe, why these societies later down the road are going to be sort of technologically more advanced than some of our societies in Polynesia, Australia, Africa, North and South America. Um, a lot of scientists, and again, our lens is to look for a sort of rational scientific explanation for things, right? So scientists and historiographers have proposed what they found to be a scientific explanation. Why did these people succeed? Well, because their geography determined their development. They had more of the cards in their deck that made them successful early on. And so that is one theory. This is another piece of this sort of historiography puzzle that we're looking at. That is one theory as to why that was the case. So I'm going to go ahead and wrap up there. Thank you for bearing with me, and I will be back for another podcast another time.